ready as I'll ever be.
Okay. Hello and welcome to another cover seminar. This one is for me kind of personal and kind of nice to do. Today we're joined here by David Pierce, who I knew while he was working at the Pocono Record, a newspaper in Pennsylvania. It feels like many lives ago. And so he's joining us to talk about a very interesting book he wrote, Tocks Island, Damned If You Do, which is a quite interesting story of a sort of popular movement to oppose the building of a large infrastructural dam project. With that as the quick intro, I'm going to hand it over to you, David, and I'm going to be running your slides, okay? Thanks for coming along.
Okay. Thank you. This happens to be the name of my book, Tocks Island, Damned If You Do, and I tried to use a pun there, or I did use a pun. I don't know how effective it is part of the title, but it's damned, not like damnation, but damned as in damming the Delaware River, which you see there on the right, and then the rest of the title of the book is the Homegrown Movement that defeated the Delaware River Dam. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, and basically we're talking about a creation of a dam and a reservoir, and how the federal government through the Army Corps of Engineers took property. They were looking to take up to 70,000 acres to have a 37-mile reservoir and a surrounding recreation area. And on the left is the cover of the acquisition procedures book. Basically, the Army Corps is handing us out to people and saying, hey, you have to give up your home, your property, your camp, your farm, whatever the case may be, to the government for the greater good. And it's enshrined in the Constitution that the federal government is allowed to do that if something is deemed to serve a greater good for a greater number of people. And they were looking to dam the river for flood control, and recreation was a minor thing that they were talking about doing, which is why they had the surrounding thing. But primarily it was hydroelectricity and flood control. And then on the right is a picture of Tocks Island, and that became the it's actually a small body of water in the Delaware River. It's about not quite a mile long, and it's a lot narrower than that. But anyway, that's basically what my topic is today. And you can move on to the next slide, please.
1 second. There we go.
Okay. This shows on the east coast of the United States some of the river basins, and I don't know if you can see it in here or not. I'm using my arrow. I'm not sure if it's coming up on your end, but that's the Delaware River. And then you see it's almost like a pitchfork, the two prongs up here. And those are the tributaries, the headwaters in New York State of the Delaware River. And it's today the Delaware River is the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi River, even though at 330 miles long, there are a lot of rivers in the United States and North America that are longer than that. And but because those other areas have dams, it impedes the flow, the population of shads, which is a type of herring, and that fish continues to kind of like salmon and some other fish. They spawn in freshwater inland, and then they migrate out to the ocean and spend their lives in the ocean and come back and breed again. And because the Delaware is undammed, they can do that. And other river systems have seen their shad populations crashed to almost nothing. And even putting in fish ladders along the dams, very few fish can make that journey up there and to get back to their spawning grounds. And this, just wanted to mention here that New York City had a huge water shortage, and they needed that resource. And the Delaware, as I mentioned, 330 miles long. It started in New York State, and then it constituted the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, New Jersey to the east and Pennsylvania to the west. And then it emptied into Delaware Bay at the state of Delaware and out into the ocean. And New York City, as far back as the 20s, wanted to dam their tributary streams and prevent the water from even getting into the Delaware and reducing the flow. And this was a concern of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And the US Supreme Court in 1931 said that New York City could dam one of the tributaries, and then they went back to the Supreme Court in the early 50s, and eventually New York City was able to create three tributary streams, diverting 800 million gallons a day before it could even reach the Delaware. So it's permanently lowered the level, even though it's a free-flowing river. Next slide, please. And as I said, there's a long involved history in all this. And I'll try not to confuse you too much with this map, but the Army Corps put this out circa 1957. And it shows all the possible dams they had under consideration. And here's the Delaware River, and this is the area kind of in Tocks Island where they talked about damming it. But one thing I wanted to point out here in this map, you see this dotted line here from the New York State tributaries, and it comes all the way down here towards New York City. And that's an 80-mile tunnel that they use to bring water from those Delaware headwaters, because New York City is not in the Delaware River basin, but yet they're able to withdraw this water. And that 80-mile tunnel, at the time it was built, was dubbed the longest tunnel in the world, and I assume that it probably still is the longest in the world today. And to fill in the story a little bit more, I know this is a complex subject, but they were going to build this dam at Walpeck Bend, which would have Pennsylvania and New Jersey wanted to build it on their own at Walpeck Bend, which would have created a 30-mile reservoir, but there was a flood in 1955 that didn't kill anyone on the Delaware River itself, but on tributary streams, including the Broadhead Creek in Monroe County, 75 people died. And then north of there on Wallenpaupack Creek, another 13 died. And at that point, the federal government intervened, and Congress and President Eisenhower and said that we want the Army Corps of Engineers, who are responsible for doing such studies, to evaluate whether it's appropriate to let Pennsylvania and New Jersey build there from Walpack Bend going north, or if some other solution to flooding should be done. And so Pennsylvania and New Jersey's plans were put on hold, and it took 6 years for the Army Corps of Engineers to complete its study and make its recommendations to the Congress and the President. Next slide, please. And what the Army Corps did is this area includes both the proposed dam and the national recreation area surrounding it. But basically, they recommended building the dam south of Walpack Bend, where Pennsylvania and New Jersey wanted to build it, and instead build it 7 miles farther south to create a larger reservoir. And one of the reasons why Pennsylvania and New Jersey went with a smaller reservoir north of there to begin with is that a previous Army Corps study, the Army Corps itself, back in the 40s, said that that the loose soil didn't make it conducive to building a dam, that the dam would be in danger of collapsing if they built at Tocks Island. So that's why Pennsylvania and New Jersey decided to build north of there. But the Army Corps came back and said, well, we think we can deal with the problems of the loose subsoil and the glacial till, and build an earthen dam that would be solid enough not to collapse, and by allowing more water into the reservoir, they could meet all the needs of the dam. You know, that they can keep it full enough to provide drinking water for New York City and other areas, and yet keep it empty enough that if there's a lot of rain and we're flooding, that it can absorb some of the floodwaters, and also provide some recreation in addition to that. And we could move on to the next slide, please. And I already mentioned some of this information, that the reservoir for Tocks Island would be 37 miles long and about a mile wide. They're talking about taking 70,000 acres in total. About 25 to 30,000 acres of that would have been for the dam, and the rest for recreation. It would have been about 435 feet high in most places in the reservoir, and there are some steep ridges over in New Jersey. The ridges would reach up to 800 feet high, and in Pennsylvania side, in most places, it was around 600 feet high, right there on either side of the river. So it created a natural area to try to contain water. But it also involved several townships, camps, family homes, and farms being underwater, and so the federal government went along with that. Congress approved building a dam in the early 60s, 1962. And the Army Corps was placed in charge of acquiring all the land. However, eventually the Army Corps was going to transfer part of that 70,000 acres to the National Park Service that would run a national recreation area near the dam. Next slide, please. And there's Stephen Shukaitis' grandmother, Nancy Shukaitis. This was taken, I think, around 1988, which would have placed her in her 50s then. But in 1963, 1 year after the dam was approved, but before the recreation area was approved, Nancy was 38 years old, and she wrote an anti-dam letters to the Pocono Record, back then called the Daily Record, and to other publications. And she attended a meeting of the anti-dam committee, which was headed by a summer resident of New Jersey, Henry Schnitzer, and that committee was based in the town of Bushkill, which is a thriving little community, several hundred residents. And other opponents also materialized on the New Jersey side. But one of the things made Nancy unique is that the government held all these meetings well away from the region where the dam was actually going to be built. They had meetings, the Army Corps had meetings in New York City and Philadelphia. And of course, there are hearings and meetings in Washington. And most people in the early 60s that were slated to lose their homes, they really didn't have the means to go to Washington or even to Philadelphia and attend these hearings. But Nancy made a point of doing that, and therefore she was the only person who testified at a lot of these meetings against the dam. And she really had a quick wit and an analytical mind, and she would do battle single-handedly a lot of times. And there was one instance where the mayor of Easton, Pennsylvania, testified. His name is George Smith, the Mayor Smith, and he said that as he spoke, they put up slides on a big screen showing a bunch of dead bodies covered with white sheets, and he said Easton needs this dam to be built to protect our people because the Delaware is in danger of killing people just like it did in 1955. And Nancy looked at those slides and she recognized the funeral home, and that was just a few miles from her house in East Stroudsburg. And so when it was her turn to testify, it was actually the first meeting in her life that she ever testified, and she had these prepared notes that she was going to read. But before she started, she made a point of calling out Mayor Smith and saying, nobody died in the Delaware. You know, that's a false impression you're creating by putting up those slides and claiming it had something to do with the Delaware River, because it didn't. And after she sat down, it turns out she was seated just a couple of persons down from the mayor, and she overheard the mayor saying it must have been a public relations outfit that got her to say that. And Nancy said to me, now what public relations outfit would that be? Because you know, they were just a group of residents fighting the system, fighting against all kinds of levels of governments and political alliances and regulatory people. But she just kept battling and battling and going to these forums. Next slide, please. And in 1965, this was when they had the hearing on creating the recreation area that would go around the reservoir. And here's a rendering of Tocks Island, and then over here is Labar Island. And the Army Corps said that they would solve the problems of the loose glacial till by just doing a bunch of testing over a 5-mile range in here, and they would pick the narrowest area that would and require the least amount of remediation to make it safe, and then that would flood vast amounts of territory going northward up this way. And Nancy Shukaitis continued to focus on dam safety. She went to Washington, and the subcommittee holding the hearing, members of Congress kept saying that this hearing is just on the recreation area. The dam's already been approved, but Nancy would insist on saying you have to go back and address the safety of a dam that might burst. And while she was at it, she said, you know, you guys need to have a hearing in the region where you're taking property. It's not fair to just do it here in Washington. And the chairman of the committee, a congressman from Alaska, said that, hey, we have votes here on issues every day, and we have to stay in the Capitol to do our jobs on every issue. And we're not going to go into every nook and cranny just to have a hearing. But he said that we'll leave the record open for one more week. And during that week, if you want to mail in written comments, and we'll accept them. And then we're going to close it out. And Nancy Shukaitis went home to Pennsylvania and started a petition drive demanding a hearing. And she collected over 600 signatures in about 4 days by just having places in stores and post offices and other areas where people could sign this petition. One of the local school districts involved circulated the petition, and teachers and staff signed it demanding a local hearing. And so she sent in those 600 signatures and started collecting more. And eventually they agreed to hold the hearing, and it took place at East Stroudsburg High School auditorium. And despite her, Nancy, doing that, and she also formed a committee of her neighbors, about 40 of them, called the Delaware Valley Conservation Association. But she was tired of going to hearings and having the hearing moderator say, "Who do you represent?" And she would say, "I'm a landowner." And she thought that having a group of landowners forming an organization like that, opposing the dam and the recreation area, would bolster their clout somewhat. But at this hearing, they were outnumbered even among residents here. At that time, most people figured, well, if we need to control floods and to give New York City drinking water and industry potable water, then I guess that's what we have to do. And so she was in a minority at that point. Next slide, please. And that organization of Nancy Shukaitis's, the Delaware Valley Conservation Association, in 1966, and they started trying to recruit new members. And she knew that she had to reach out across the river to New Jersey primarily. And they went door to door canvassing. Nancy's husband, Joe Shukaitis, also was involved with that, knocking on doors and just explaining what the situation was for them and losing their property, and that if they joined forces together, perhaps they could reverse this thing yet. And they recruited 500 new members, and then they hired an attorney and filed a federal lawsuit trying to reverse the approval for the property acquisitions. And one of the things that the opponents charged was that the buyout prices were too low, that the Constitution said that the federal government had to offer a fair price, but the court disagreed. And in this situation, when they're acquiring property, the appraisers were hired by, they did have appraisals, but the government had its own appraisers and brought them in. And you could see that maybe a lot of the forced sellers would feel like they're being lowballed somewhat. But the federal government agreed, saying that the Constitution is clear that they can do that. And then meanwhile, another opponent, Joan Matheson, what made her interesting, one of the things that made her interesting was that she was the wife of an Army Corps engineer. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army, trained, got an engineering degree at the Army Academy at West Point, and she actually started what in those days we called an underground newspaper, and it was basically centered around the dam and reservoirs and river issues. And they look for things in the mainstream media and in newspapers, articles, and collected information there. But Joan also went to a lot of the Army Corps, started going to Army Corps meetings and so forth. And the Mathesons, they bought their home in 1960 in this region that was going to be taken for the dam. But in 1962, Colonel Matheson was ordered to go to France and was posted there to oversee the graves of World War II American soldiers who are buried over there. And so she was gone from the area for 4 years. And then they returned in 1966, and she started this underground newspaper. And she called it the Menacing Bull, because she said that basically it was bullshit. It was the implication there of all the positive claims being made about the dam. And then in 1967, Nancy Shukaitis, meanwhile, she had been involved in local Republican Party politics, not in a huge way. She was named a committee woman, but when she asked, well, what does a committee woman do? And she was told, well, the main thing they do is they drive our voters to the polls to make sure they vote, and we elect the Republicans to local, state, and national offices. But anyway, that gave her some insights into how campaigns are conducted, and she's decided to run and was elected a Monroe County Commissioner in 1967. By the way, she was the first woman in the history of Monroe County to become a commissioner, and she joined the 3-member board that deals with county policies. Next slide, please. This is Bushkill, Pennsylvania, one of the communities I just mentioned, and this town would have been underwater if the reservoir had been built, if the dam had been built. But it was a thriving community. They had 2 churches there. They had 2 gas stations and auto repair shops. It had a small grocery store and a butcher shop and a bank. And in this section of town here, out of all these buildings, this white one here, kind of in the center, is the only one that's still standing today. All the others, even though they never built the reservoir, the government bought the property, and the buildings were either torn down by contractors hired by the Corps, or they some buildings in the 70,000 acres just rotted from neglect and continue to rot today in some cases because there's no money available to rehab them in any way. Next slide, please. And one thing the Corps did do at the time of acquisitions is that they would give, first of all, they would give the sellers who are losing their homes the option of keeping their home and having it moved to a higher ground, to somewhere else. You know, if you could buy a plot of land, maybe you'd pay $150, $200 for your house, or it'd be deducted from the value that the government paid you to take your home. They would let you have it for a couple $100, but then the problem would be getting it out of there, and getting a home lot. And they would move it in like 7 separate pieces a lot of times to drive it out of there. They'd make those trips, and then they'd reassemble the house, and then of course you'd have to put in a septic system, a water system, and it would cost, even though it would cost you hundreds to get the house, it would cost you thousands to move it, and then still more money to hook it up to the utilities. And these sales tactics of the Army Corps, or the perception of it, it helped in the mid and late 60s to move public opinion to being more against the dam, the sales tactics. And then of course, environmentalism, they used to talk about conservationists, but conservationists would consider having a reservoir as conservation in a sense, but they weren't conserving the animals. They were just conserving the water for human needs. But of course, the ecology movement and environmentalism became more of the focus of more people in the late 60s and early 70s. Next slide, please. Walpack is another town. This one's in New Jersey, and they had a developer who built hundreds of homes in this region down here, and a lot of them were there were a few permanent residents, but most of these were basically summer homes for people in the more urban areas in New Jersey who could afford to buy a second home. But down in this area is where more of the year-round residents live, and there may have been 200 to 300, depending on what year it was. There were probably 200 to 300 year-round residents, but there could be in the summer up to 800 or 1,000 summer residents who weren't really using township services, but were contributing to the to the township tax coffers. And anyway, even as the government was acquiring property, Walpeck Township Township Board was approving developers' home expansions, and the Army Corps was just trying to get in front of that, and there was one proposal that just tried to get Congress to approve $30 million immediately so that they could at least buy up all the land that would go to the recreation area. But that failed to gain traction in Congress, and one of the main reasons for that is because of the Vietnam War, when we had we ended up we had hundreds of thousands of troops and American troops serving in Vietnam, and it was putting pressures on the entire federal budget, and it was also fueling inflation, which was started in the mid 60s and probably lasted until the early 80s of the American public living with high inflation. And so the Vietnam War, they tried to get a handle on spending and costs and inflation, basically by the government trying to cut back funding everywhere else except the Vietnam War effort as best they could. And anyway, that's kind of an overview of what's happening there. Next slide, please. Oh, could you go back just a second, Stephen? Thank you. It's color coded here, and I just wanted to mention that this green area, when it's in green, it's for the recreation area, and here in pink or red, that's for the reservoir. And you can tell that they're partially shaded here, and this was about a 1972 map, and it showed the progress of the land acquisitions. So, so after 6 or 7 years, this is what the government had acquired, the darker areas. But you can see that there are white areas in here, and particularly for the dam, they were really slow to acquire property. So people are just sitting there saying, "Oh, I'm going to lose my home," but will it be next year? Will it be the year after next year? And that was one of the things that frustrated people who are losing their homes, and in the community and in the region as a whole, helped turn public opinion from pro-dam to anti-dam. And now you can go on to the next slide. And this is an aerial photo. It's actually taken for a court case, but this is on the Pennsylvania side, and you can see this is a low flat land next to the Delaware River. But up here is the beginning of the ridges, the Appalachian Plateau. But you can see why it was thought to be a good place to dam up the water and contain it. But the reason why I say boom here is that the Pappalardo family, Sal and Mary Pappalardo and their 6 children, they own one of these homes in here on this side, And then a couple of miles away across the Delaware River and in New Jersey, it's not on the photo, but way off in the distance, the Army Corps was doing stratification studies to test the soil and the subsoil to see where would be a safe place to put this dam. And to do that, they were doing blasting. It's a heavy rock formations throughout, and they had to blast to get in there and to see what's going on. They decided that we'll build this test tunnel that will be 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. And then once we get this tunnel built, we can go in there and do our stratification studies. And so they would do blasting that, maybe every other day from the summer of '68 into January of '69. They were blasting every couple of days, and the Pappalardos over here, they would hear a siren, and so they knew that meant that a blast was coming. And then every time they blasted over here in New Jersey, their home in Pennsylvania was getting rocked, and the ceilings and the walls were cracking, and holes were developing. And Sal Pappalardo actually laid tile for a living, and their tile is getting ruined. And the Pappalardos were calling the head of land acquisition for this project with the Army Corps and contacting their congressman repeatedly. Didn't really hear back from anybody for a long time. And then finally, around December of '68, the congressman said the Army Corps told the Pappalardos that the Army Corps had said that they're done with their blasting, that they created their test tunnel, and I need to back up a little bit, that the Army Corps announced just before that because it had been so long since their last appraisal, and there's been and a lot of stuff has happened, that they need to send it in the appraisers again. And they're basically saying to the Pappalardos that your home's not worth as much anymore because of the damage that was created by the Army Corps' own test tunnel. And of course, the Pappalardos complained that that's not fair, and they hired their own attorney, and so the congressman said that the Army Corps has contacted me, and here's the name of the contractor that we hired to do the blasting, and you contact the contractor, and they or the contractor's insurance company will pay your claim. We're still going to pay you less for your land, but you can make up for it by getting reimbursed from our contractor for the damage you caused. And the company denied any responsibility for the damage, or basically they just ignored them. They came and looked at the damage, but the company never said anything. Therefore, they went to court. They went to county court in Pennsylvania, and they got they got a judgment of money to be paid by this company, and everybody was celebrating. And in the Pappalardo household and the attorney, and then about a week later, after the trial, the attorney called the Pappalardos and said, "I'm sorry, I've got some bad news for you. This company just filed for bankruptcy, this contractor, and it just seems like that there's no way we'll ever be able to recover that money." And then 4 years later, the federal government did agree to eventually pay them another $8,000, but by then they had been forced out of their home and had to move into a trailer court. And the other significant thing about this area is that when a lot of people were being forced out of their homes and moving out, and I mentioned inflation and the Vietnam War and the slow pace of acquisitions, and the Army Corps realized that it's going to be a long time before we can rebuild this dam, and we don't want people committing acts of vandalism and doing things to what we have acquired. Therefore, we're going to start a rental program, and so they started renting out homes that they'd taken from residents against their will, more or less, and rented those homes out to people, and they advertised in kind of basically hippie publications and New York City publications. They advertised back in the urban areas that we're looking for people to temporarily rent out these buildings. And it turned out that they attracted, well, they put one ad in the Village Voice, which back then was considered the youth culture oriented hippie type of readership, and they got people from theater groups. They had a rock band that rented out one of these homes, and the locals, especially those who lost their homes, were not happy about that. And so the Army Corps, I think it was less than a year after the program started, they said, okay, we're going to end this rental program. And they informed all these people that once your lease expires, you have to leave. But they didn't leave. And in addition to that, other people, some from the immediate area, young people, and some from elsewhere, they moved into some of these homes as well without ever even having a lease. And it took a long court battle and 2 raids by U.S. Marshals before they finally evicted the squatters after a 40-month occupation. And typically in the summertime, there might be a couple of hundred people living there, but in the winter it would be down to 60 or 70 or 80 people, the hardcore ones who wanted to live there, and the others were kind of local residents, or they're college students, and they just showed up for the summer. And but anyway, that situation further caused people to sour on having a reservoir in their area. Next slide, please. So this is kind of possible. This is my summation, basically, what killed the dam. And I mentioned inflation, the Vietnam War, slowing land acquisitions, and there was a lot of land speculation in addition to the regular inflation that increased prices. And I mentioned the squatter occupation. Another factor in the early 70s, it was actually a New Year's Day, I think, in 1971, that President Nixon signed a bill, signed the National Environmental Policy Act, and it created an environmental agency right in the White House that would make recommendations on different projects from an environmental standpoint. And its members were approved by the Senate, nominated by the president of the subject to Senate confirmation. And and even though it was an advisory group, later on it became directly involved in Tocks Island because Congress attached a bill that basically said that the Army Corps couldn't move forward until they answered certain environmental issues. And they're still dealing with the problems of loose glacial till, and people worried about that. Another environmental issue that became more important in the 70s was they're worried about the drawdown of water, that as they use water for other uses and lowered the level of the reservoir, that the still water would create mud flats and insects and different waterborne diseases. And another issue they're worried about is that upstream, mostly in New York State, but in Pennsylvania and New Jersey to a lesser extent, that farmers had chickens and cattle, dairy farms, and that their waste, as well as human waste, feces, would get into the water. And because it's not free flowing anymore, once you create a 37-mile reservoir, a lake, that would spawn algae and create another problem. And the White House Council on Environmental Quality and the Environmental Protection Agency, which also was created in the early 70s, and protesters, people in general, and members of Congress were saying, you have to address this. And there was an elaborate proposal with $360 million project of different sewer treatment plants and sewer lines and so forth. And that was in 1970s dollars, to spend $360 million on that. And so that was another nail in the coffin of that. And there were voter referendums in 2 counties that voted against building a dam and a reservoir, and that there was a second referendum question that showed most people supported transferring that property for the reservoir to the recreation area. And that in 1975, the 4 basin state governors met in a hotel in downtown Newark, New Jersey, and voted 3-1. The 3 governors voted not to build the dam, and only the Pennsylvania Governor Shapp voted for the dam. And it basically wasn't officially killed. They didn't officially kill the dam until 1992, but after 1975 and the governor's vote saying, we don't really want to do this anymore, the Army Corps backed away, and they never pushed again for a dam. And although some people wanted at least to keep the property in reserve and maybe build a dam there if the need for water happened 20, 25 years down the road. But by 1992, legislation officially disbanded the dam, and today it's a national park. The entire 70,000 acres, minus 6,000 acres that's operated in New Jersey as Forestry Bureau, as a separate kind of a state park and camping area within the recreation area. So, and there's a lot of hiking, tourism, waterfalls, and it's more of a vacation draw and trying to get back people who want to take in nature, and that's the way things stand. And thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Cover, for inviting me to this event. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks. Can I ask you a few questions?
Sure, go right ahead.
So I've heard many parts of the story told to me growing up, and there was a few things that impressed me about it. One is that when you have a group of people who start out as farmers or clerks, or who aren't like like super educated, who then start a movement and unlearn all this technical knowledge about geology, about soil composition, learning all these things in order to like basically fight the federal government, the Army Corps, all these agencies, right?
Right.
So it's almost like there's like this process of almost, I guess you'd call it like citizen science that you had to get involved in to understand what you were fighting.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. And yeah, and it's amazing that they're talking about all this stuff, but it was in the daily media. I mean, the Daily Record, which became the Pocono Record in 1965, that they had stories every day. They basically pushed the Vietnam War off the front pages, and that was a big deal. The Vietnam War, 55,000 American soldiers died there, and yet everybody's just consumed about what's going on in their town, and and in their region, and it gradually became the big topic that everyone always talked about. And I guess that in itself, just reading the paper every day, you'd start to understand concepts. But and then Joan Matheson had her underground newspaper. It was basically 8.5 by 11, or I guess it would have been like 11-point legal size paper folded over, and then those were the pages of her publication, and she'd have them Xeroxed. And she was also an artist, so in addition to going to these meetings, she did a lot of these political cartoons, and they would bring up these things about mud flats, and then they'd make fun of it, which would get people to explore the issue. Like she called this $360 million sewer project, she called it Frankenstein's John. And so people would say, and young people in general, I think, were becoming more in tune with stuff because so much was going on, and so was media access.
Mm. Another thing I found interesting, and this, for my grandmother, for Nancy, as she talked to people who were being displaced by the proposed dam, she had this mental shift where then she started to understand their displacement as being almost similar to like the way that the Native Americans were displaced. And then she sort of started to then learn about indigenous history. And so then she made all these interesting connections between different histories of displacement, which I found super interesting because she was still a lifelong Republican, but then she was seeing these things that she hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, yeah. She would have been the 6th generation that lived on that basic same piece of land. I mean, they would subdivide it as the families moved on from generation to generation. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I wasn't. What was your question, Stephen?
I guess I'm just interested in the ways in which, because because you're
okay,
thinking about displacement, how displacement of her community, then how they're thinking about the displacement of the Native Americans.
yeah,
And so I remember, like, for instance, in the early 2000s, she was actually interested in the Zapatistas in Mexico because she understood she developed a different conception of indigenous politics and how that shaped her worldview.
yeah, yeah. I think that she probably looked at her own ancestry, first of all, when you think about those questions when you lose the property and realize, well, how long, it's been a long time in our family. And you look back and see that it's 6 generations. I think once you make that, you say, well, where did that first generation get it from? And you say, oh, they forced the Lenni Lenapes off the land. And now all these generations later, we're experiencing some of the same thing. Maybe it's a little more humane than what happened to the Native Americans, the Indians. But I think that probably caused her and other people, and she wasn't the only one that had long ancestry in that region, it probably caused a lot of people losing their homes to think about that and maybe explore that issue more because it's happening to them.
Um, do you have anything you want to ask Phoebe? It's okay if not.
Yeah, no, I don't know if the problem is that I've got a kind of external speaker, so I might be echoing quite a lot. Let me just turn it off. Sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, okay, good. No, that was really interesting. I'm actually really fascinated with the kind of extraction and the extractivism literature right now. So I was watching and listening to your talk in that kind of context because I think it gives really a fascinating kind of historical basis for some of this power relation, and also in hearing about your aunt. Am I getting this right? She's your aunt, right, Stephen?
Grandmother.
Grandmother.
Great aunt. Oh, well, I heard aunt, great aunt first. Oh, grandmother. Okay, good. I heard wrong because yeah, you've been talking about this, but this is really interesting because it's basically her like the politics of and the work that she was doing. And I'm just wondering because have you looked also at her the kind of constellation of what how also what she was involved with and things like that, and what if there's a difference in terms of that social relationality and the extraction and the current, because that's something that is really interesting for me. So I don't know if that's something you've been kind of thinking about or you're writing about at all, David, or
The, the, the extraction to our current events, you mean, or?
no resource
Hmm.
in terms of resource. Well,
Oh,
I think what I'm hearing from you.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that despite all the growth, it seems like we are getting along with enough water, but New York City,
Only because you yeah, go ahead.
yeah, but you know, New Jersey was worried about where its water is going to come from
Yeah.
because
Right. Okay. So that's
had a
kind
lot
of
of the urban overflow of New York City moving
yeah.
into the suburbs, and they built a reservoir of their own in central New Jersey, and I guess that's been enough to
Yeah.
satisfy their needs, at least up to this point.
Yeah. That, I mean, it's just fascinating how these things and also right now with the kind of with COPs happening, I've been watching a lot how this is being framed in terms of supposedly climate and change, or just in terms of how it's being framed. So what's your, I mean, it's just, I don't know, it just like, I find it so interesting that you have this very materiality around kind of what's prioritized or what's kind of considered, and then the social relations around how extraction then has this very direct impact. I don't know, it's just fascinating stuff because it's kind of like I don't understand. I don't know. It's just, I mean, it's happened also. The other interesting thing is having this US case, which you hear or you have heard, we've heard a lot where this happens kind of in China. Oh, hundreds of houses are being, flattened or entire areas and this kind of stuff. But you don't hear as much about it. And are you one of the main people doing this kind of research, or it might just be
Well,
my
well, I had a situation for 11 years. I was editor of a weekly newspaper in suburban Buffalo, New York, just south
okay.
of Buffalo, about 30 miles. And in our coverage area, we we had a cleanup of a nuclear fuel reprocessing center. It's the only one
Okay.
that ever operated in the United States. And they would take the spent fuel rods from the commercial electric plants
Yeah.
and they try to clean up the radioactivity a little bit, or whatever they had to do to reprocess them, and then so they could reuse them at the nuclear plants.
Okay.
And it turned out to be one problem after another, and
Oh,
they used eminent domain there as well
okay.
to take the land. It was on a smaller scale than the 70,000 acres, but but now they have a joint cleanup that's been going on since 1980, 90% federally funded and 10% funded by New York State. And they they did move a bunch of fuel rods they had. They put them on a
Oh,
crane and took them out west to a repository, which kind of makes it someone else's problem. But they still have a lot of radiation levels, and 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 this started around 1960 when the technology was not as good as it is today, and the knowledge was not as good, and they like buried whole train cars
okay.
and some other stuff going on, uh, and I remember one day I'm covering a meeting and we're talking about transuranic waste, and I said, transuranic, what's that? And it was
Okay.
chemical waste and radioactive waste mixed together, but they really do have a good monitoring program. But if we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, I don't know, can we
Yeah.
keep that up?
If I,
Okay.
if I if I could jump in here, one of the things that makes it a bit hard to explain this history today is because keep in mind, my grandmother, many people who are involved here are lifelong Republicans,
Yeah. Okay. You know, I noticed that, yeah, of course she's Republican.
and they're coming from a strain of republicanism that is nothing unlike today's Republicans. So I mean by that, at least my understanding, and tell me if I'm wrong, David, it was a version of republicanism which was almost like the people who best know how to take care of the land are like smallholding farmers because they're
Yeah.
directly working with the areas they own, right?
Oh,
Right.
true.
So it was a kind of conservationism that was based upon this like intense local connection. Um, but it still thought of itself as Republican, but it's a kind of a Republican, yeah, it just doesn't seem anything like today's, yeah, anyways.
Yeah, it was more of we're
Different.
self-reliant, so leave us
Yeah. Small
alone.
C and large.
And now it's more grievance, I think, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess you say it's a different kind of basis of how people live, a different, yeah, it just was, yeah.
Crabgrass nationalism, that concept where it's kind of
Yeah.
like, and then the survivalism, and we can go down that sort of like, right.
But yet when you look at the environmental movement in the United States, President Nixon, believe it or not, has probably done more than anyone out of all our presidents. I mean, uh, he had that advisory group with him. Initially, he was against it, but he supported it, and uh, they they supported the environmental views of a lot of people on these things. And the Environmental Protection Agency was founded while he was president.
Strategic complicity, maybe we can
Yeah.
nudge the views. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of a broader question, but there's also things when you have Nixon could do things because he was a Republican. So, for instance, Nixon was the first president to go to China, like,
Yeah.
and that wouldn't have been possible if he was. I don't think if he was a Democrat. So you have this weird thing where the UK equivalent is that the Labour Party can privatize more things than the Conservatives, which is just weird, but it happens.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
There are some parallels there, it seems like, between the UK and the United States.
Yeah. There's also very weird ones like if I remember correctly, the annual Thanksgiving football match between Stroudsburg and East Stroudsburg. The nicknames of the two teams are the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, which mirrors the nicknames of the sides during the English Civil
The
War.
Mounties.
Oh, sorry, the Mounties. I get it wrong. Sorry. Oh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
1974 Stroudsburg High School grad. But yeah, they used to play it every year on Thanksgiving Day, which is one of the biggest holidays in the United States.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah.
They play football in the morning, and then people would go home and eat a big turkey dinner with the relatives in the afternoon.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm gonna say take that point and say thanks for coming along, David. I'm very interesting. I'm very informative,
Really interesting.
and I really like your book. It's the first time I've read someone's book to learn more about my grandmother.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Quite
yeah,
cool.
she was interesting. I wasn't sure how she was going to react at first. I interviewed her a couple of times at events that went on, or she got some kind of award locally. But when I told her I'd like to write a book, she was very friendly, but I wasn't sure how receptive she was going to be to that. But eventually, after interviewing her a couple of times, I said, "Do you mind if I could go through your archives, your papers?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Let me think about it." And then a week or two later, she said that I just heard back. I can't remember if it was Lafayette College or no, it wasn't. It wasn't there, but some university in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania was going to take her papers, and she said that the university informed me they would like to get them within 2 weeks, and you can go through them as much as you want in that time. And I would go through a few papers at a time and take them to the East Stroudsburg University Library and make copies of what I needed and returned them to her. And I learned a lot about your grandfather, Joe, and he had quite a life of what he went through in his youth with fighting a series of arson fires that caused some debilitating health problems he had to deal with all his life. And
Oh,
Yeah.
where were the fires?
the fires were in Schuylkill County, which is more in the interior of Pennsylvania, but they all took place downtown. It's like every few weeks another building would catch on fire, and I don't think they ever did catch the arsonist,
Oh,
but he had constant smoke inhalation, and and
Oh.
and then there was some kind of botched procedure that he had to clear his lung out or something, and the lung collapsed, and they had to go in there and basically reinflate that area. And I think they might have taken a couple of ribs out or something, but
ah,
I'm definitely talking out of my league here a little bit as far as medical stuff goes, but I think I explained it a little bit better in the book. But anyway, he was told basically, well, the way Nancy said it, Nancy said the doctors told Joe they had to live like an old man, like early to bed, a good diet, and not too much activity. And that's what he's told to do. But Joe did volunteer for a lot of different organizations, and he did work.
huh.
You know, during his regular working life, and so a very interesting family.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Sure. And thank you for having me. And I hope I didn't meander too much, but it really is a complex subject to try to plow through. But yet it had all these weird things that happen, like like I mentioned about the squatters just living there for 4 years,
Yeah, that's fascinating.
and some of them taking up farming and doing what the displaced people did, and until one day they finally got a court order and federal marshals to move them out.